Hi friends! I brought Pioneer Girl, the story of Laura Ingalls Wilder by William Anderson to read with you today. Long ago in 1867, when America was the land of dense forests and wide open prairies, a pioneer girl named Laura Ingalls was born. She lived with her pa and ma and her older sister Mary in a little log house along the big trees of Wisconsin. Laura's earliest memories were of her pa and ma packing everything they owned into a covered wagon and went all their clothes, dishes, bedding, and books in pa's fiddle. Laura's family left the little house and traveled for days and weeks. They were going to Kansas. On a grassy, flat prairie, Pa finally found a spot for a new little house. Log by log, Pa and Ma built the house, and Laura helped Pa build the door. Laura was happy living on the prairie, running in the wind with Jack the bulldog, or exploring in the tall grass with Mary. An Indian trail curved right through the Ingalls farm, and Laura often saw Indians. Although the Ingalls did not know it, they had settled on land that belonged to the Osage Indians. Before they had been in the new house on the prairie for a year, Pa said they would have to leave. So once more, Laura rode in the covered wagon with Pa and Ma and Mary and new baby sister Carrie. They returned to where they had started, the little house in the big woods of Wisconsin. The days were full of work, and Pa went far into the woods to hunt for meat and trap for furs. Ma was always busy, and Mary and Laura helped to churn butter, sew quilts, wash dishes, and sweep the log floor. Laura's special job was to bring in chips from the wood pile. She filled her apron full, for the fire on the hearth must never burn out. At night, Pa played his fiddle, and music filled the little house from the pantry to the attic. Sometimes wolves howled outside, but Laura knew that Pa and Jack would keep them all safe. As Laura grew older, more and more settlers crowded into the big woods. Pa wanted to be where neighbors were not so close and wild animals roamed free. So on Laura's 17th birthday, Mary, Laura, and Carrie were once again bundled inside the covered wagon. As they drove away, they saw their little log house for the last time. They headed west to the wide open prairies of Minnesota. Pa found a new farm along Plum Creek near the little town of Walnut Grove. At first, they lived in a tiny one-room house that was hollowed into the bank of a creek. Its roof was made of sod and the same thick tangled grass that grew on the prairie. The dugout was cool in the summer and snug in the winter, and the Ingalls lived in it until Pa built a wonderful new house made of sawn lumber. Nearby, he grew a field of golden wheat. Laura and Mary went to school in Walnut Grove. There, Laura made new friends and learned to love reading and writing. And then one terrible day, grasshoppers dropped from the sky, eating Pa's wheat crop and every other green growing thing. There was no crop for Pa to sell, and so Pa had to go far away to find work. Laura and Mary helped with the chores on the farm, and Ma taught the girls their lessons at home. The girls could not walk to school anymore because the ground was covered with grasshoppers. They were all very busy, but still the weeks and months without Pa were long and lonely. Pa finally came home, but he was restless in grasshopper country. Laura was not surprised when Pa told them that they were going to move again. This time, they were going to go to the town of Burr Oak, Iowa, to help run a hotel. The Burr Oak Hotel was a bustling place with people coming and going and covered wagons parked in the yard each night. When they were not in school, Laura and Mary helped in the kitchen and washed piles of dishes. Laura also took the cow to the pasture in the morning and brought her back home at night, and often she ran errands for the hotel's guests. One day, when Laura returned home, she found she had a brand new baby sister. Pa and Ma named the baby Grace. Laura and her family were busy in Burr Oak, but they all missed the prairie country, and so after 2 years, they left Burr Oak and returned to Walnut Grove. And then Pa traveled far away by covered wagon to begin a job as storekeeper for the new railroad line that was being built to link Minnesota and Dakota Territory. Ma and the girls followed Pa by train. Laura was now 12, and she had a special duty. During a long sickness, Mary had become blind, and Pa asked Laura to become Mary's eyes. So all the way to Dakota Territory, Laura told Mary about the train's smoking engine and about the people who sat on the plush red velvet seats in the train car. When the family was settled in the railroad camp, Laura told Mary about the railroad men and their strong horses busily working to build the track across the rolling prairie. During their first winter in Dakota Territory, Laura's family had almost no neighbors. But in the spring, farmers crowded onto the land, and the town of DeSummit sprang up overnight. Laura and Pa missed the empty prairie, but the Ingalls family would move no more. Pa had promised Ma that they would stay in DeSummit so the girls could go to school. During the summer, the family lived on their homestead, but in the winter, they lived in town so Laura and Carrie could walk to school. At night, Laura repeated her lessons to Mary so Mary could keep up with her studies too. Mary wanted to go to the College for the Blind in Iowa, and Laura wanted to help her in any way that she could. The winters in Dakota Territory were fierce, and sometimes Laura and Carrie could not walk to the schoolhouse because of the snow. One winter, the blizzards were so severe that the train stopped running and the stores ran out of food and fuel. For months, Laura's family huddled together in their town building. Laura twisted hay to burn and ground wheat for flour until her hands ached. Everyone might have starved, but 2 boys, Almanzo Wilder and Cap Garland, made a dangerous trip across the frozen prairie to bring food back to the hungry townspeople. When Laura was 15, she became a teacher in a tiny school 12 miles from DeSummit. There were just 5 students, and 2 were almost Laura's age, but Laura was a good teacher. She lived with a family near the school and was very lonely for Ma and Pa and her sisters. She did not expect to see her family for the 2 months that she would be teaching, but as her first week of teaching ended, Almanzo Wilder came with his sleigh and fast horses to take Laura home. Each Friday, Almanzo drove Laura home, and each Sunday he brought her back to school. Laura loved skimming across snowy prairie behind Almanzo's beautiful brown horses. And when school ended, she had earned $40 to help pay Mary's expenses at the College for the Blind. When Laura returned to DeSummit, Almanzo still took her on sleigh rides. And in the spring, he took her for rides in his shiny black buggy. They rode to singing school, to church parties, to ice cream socials, and to see Almanzo's homestead claim. They went to the nearby lakes where they picked prairie roses and wild grapes and listened to the waves lapping against the shore. On one of the rides, Almanzo asked Laura to marry him, and she said yes. In 1885, when Laura was 18, she and Almanzo were married and went to live in their own little gray house on the prairie. Laura was no longer a pioneer girl. She was now a homesteader's wife, and she soon learned to cook and bake and clean as well as Ma. But Laura still loved to be outdoors on the prairie. She and Almanzo galloped across the prairie on their horses to visit Pa and Ma or to watch a glorious sunset. In the second winter they were married, Laura and Almanzo had their own daughter. They named her Rose for the sweet-smelling blossoms that covered the prairies in summer. After Rose was born, sad times came to the Wilders. First, the crops dried up in the hot weather, and then Almanzo and Laura became ill, and after they recovered, Almanzo could not use his right leg very well. Far worse, Laura and Almanzo's second child, a boy, died soon after he was born. And then one terrible day, the little gray house burned down. These were unhappy days for Laura, but she was a pioneer and she knew she was tougher than hard times. Hoping to make a fresh start, Laura, Almanzo, and Rose left the prairie and traveled south by train to Florida. They thought that the warmer weather would make Almanzo stronger, but the scrubby pine trees, sandy soil, and hot summer made the Wilders homesick. They returned to the summit, still planning to start a new farm and build another home someday. Laura sewed for $1 a day, and Almanzo worked at any job that he could. Rose was now 5, and she began school. And one day, a friend gave Laura the biggest, reddest apple she had ever seen. It came from Missouri, the land of the big red apple. Laura and Almanzo learned that there was rich farmland for sale in Missouri. And in 1894, they decided to move to Missouri and buy a farm with the $100 that Laura had been able to save from her sewing. Just as Ma and Pa had done before, Laura and Almanzo packed up all their belongings in a covered wagon to move to a new land. Laura kept a diary of the 45 days it took the family to travel from the summit to Missouri. She wrote of the hot, dusty miles, the water-starved prairie farms that they passed, and finally of Missouri's rolling green hills, apple orchards, and rushing creeks. As they drove into a town in the Ozark Mountains called Mansfield, Laura told Almanzo and Rose, "This is where we stop." They bought a hilly, tree-covered farm a mile from Mansfield, and Laura named it Rocky Ridge Farm. The Wilders moved into a tiny one-room log cabin that stood under tall trees and reminded Laura of her first home in the big woods of Wisconsin. With Rose's help, Laura cleaned the cabin and made it cozy for the coming winter, while Almanzo began clearing the land. The Wilders were finally home. Laura and Almanzo worked together to make new land a farm. They cut down trees, they cleared away stones, and planted an apple orchard. While waiting for their land to grow good crops, Laura, Almanzo, and Rose moved to the town of Mansfield. Their house was close to Mansfield's first store, and Rose quickly became one of the school's best readers, spellers, and writers, as Laura had always been. To earn money, Almanzo delivered oil and stove gas in a horse-drawn delivery wagon, and Laura cooked meals for railroad workers. Laura soon became known in Mansfield as a good cook, a hard worker, and a cheerful neighbor. She shared with the community her good ideas, such as holding the town's first church bazaar. Mansfield's people were glad that the Wilder family had come to their town. Before they moved back to Rocky Ridge Farm, Laura and Almanzo built a new house on their land using their own trees for lumber. When the house was finished, it had 10 rooms, 3 porches, and 30 windows. When she cooked or sewed or worked inside, Laura could look out on the trees and curving hills of Rocky Ridge Farm. Even as an adult, Laura liked to be outside as much as she had when she was a pioneer girl. She waded in the creek ran races up the hills with Rose, and hunted for berries in the woods. She tamed wild birds and small animals and had picnics with friends. In the evenings, Laura, Almanzo, and Rose sat around the fireplace eating popcorn and apples while Laura read aloud. She read books, newspapers, and magazines and letters from the family and to Summit. In these letters, Laura learned that Mary, who graduated from the College for the Blind, was living with Ma and Pa and helping with work at home and at church. Carrie was working at the Summit newspaper office, and Grace had married a farmer who lived nearby. One day, a letter came saying that Pa was very sick, and Laura immediately traveled back to the Summit by train and was with him when he died. Pa's pioneer spirit lived on in Laura and in Rose, too. Both Laura and Rose loved to travel to new places, and both of them were good storytellers. When Rose graduated from school, she became a journalist and traveled all over the world. She wrote books and stories about the places she'd visited, and she often sent home long letters about her adventures. Laura and Almanzo were proud that their Rose had become a famous writer. In 1915, when Laura was 48 years old, she made her farthest trip west. She traveled to San Francisco, where Rose was living, to visit her daughter and see a World's Fair. Almanzo stayed home to tend the farm, but Laura wrote him letters about the wonders that she and Rose saw, like the Pacific Ocean and the giant redwood trees and the fair exhibits. After farming for 30 years, Laura and Almanzo decided to rest. They hired another farmer to raise their crops and look after their animals. And then in their bright blue car, they took trips near and far. One trip, they traveled back to the Summit over the same roads that they had traveled in their horse-drawn wagon so many years before. Ma and Mary had died, but Laura visited Carrie and Grace. Laura was now past 60, but she had never forgotten her days as a pioneer girl. She realized how much she missed those times with Pa and Ma and her three sisters in the big woods of Wisconsin and on the western prairies. So, Laura decided to write down her memories of her childhood. She wrote whenever she had time, between cooking and working in the garden and going for drives with Almanzo. When she had finished, there were enough stories for her first book, Little House in the Big Woods. Laura wrote the book especially for children so they could know how the pioneers had lived. Children liked this book so much that Laura wrote a second one called Farmer Boy, all about Almanzo's life on a farm in northern New York when he was a boy. In houses and schools and libraries all over America, and then all over the world, children, parents, and teachers alike loved Laura's stories. They sent her letters begging her to write more. For 11 years, Laura worked on the books that came to be known as the Little House series. In them, she told the story of her life, from her childhood in the big woods, through her early years with Almanzo on the Dakota Prairie. To her great surprise, Laura's Little House books made her a famous author. She was invited to speak at schools and on the radio. Her books received awards and honors, and many libraries were named in her honor. From everywhere, children sent her letters, presents, and drawings, thanking her for her stories. Many people even traveled to Mansfield, hoping to meet Laura or just see where she lived. Laura was delighted that her books were loved by so many, and she was glad that through her stories, children could learn something of the pioneer days of America. But when she was 67, Laura decided to write no more. Instead, she and Almanzo kept busy on their farm. They went for drives, visited friends, played games, and listened to the radio. And in 1949, Almanzo died at the age of 92. Laura stayed on Rocky Ridge Farm, where there were so many memories of happy times. And although Laura lived alone until her death in 1957 at the age of 90, she was never lonely. Friends came to visit almost every day. And once Laura invited the entire 4th grade class from the Mansfield School to the farmhouse for a party. She told the children stories and let them roam through the big old house. The children ate cookies that Laura had baked and enjoyed themselves. One boy told Laura he would rather read her Little House books than eat. "I'm glad if my books have helped the children," Laura said. When people praised her stories, she was pleased that she had done what she had set out to do, to tell the tales of American pioneers for children everywhere and always. The end. I don't know about you, but I have been super inspired by Laura Ingalls Wilder and her books. They're a little long for me to read the whole series to you here, but I super encourage you to read them at home. I'll see you soon, friends. Bye-bye.